In my chat with Mary Kame and in my defining the setup video, I mentioned that I don't recommend you start with prolonged introspective scenes or the character doing very mundane things like getting up and sitting at their kitchen table. I specifically mentioned The Hunger Games being an exception because while it does start with Katniss doing mundane shit, is it mundane? The whole point of having the reader see Katniss wake up and go hunting for food for her family was to show us that they're living in a dystopian world where something as simple as getting food is a daily struggle. That is Katniss's smaller normal world conflict, and it shows who she is as a person. She isn't waiting for her mother to bring home the food. She feels the need to provide for her family and really shelter her younger sister. So not only is it a great character moment, it makes her choice to go in her sister's place during the reaping all more consistent and logical for her character as we move into that inciting incident. So today I thought I would do a more fun video and explore other scenes that I don't recommend you open with until you figured out your voice and your authorial promise to your readers. This isn't meant to be a list of firm rules, but more of a stop and consider why you're doing this sort of list of openings that can be more of a hard sell to readers. These are the types of setups I think newer authors who haven't found their voice should stay away from until they develop the instinctive understanding of when doing them maximizes impact and enhances the reader experience. Established authors, authors with a strong authorial voice, and even unpublished writers who have been critiqued a lot often have a stronger understanding of their voice and have that intrinsic understanding of why something works so that they can write the following openings with a little more sauce and a little bit more nuance that actually enhances their stories. That being said, let's dive on in. Number 1. Cliché introspection scenes, particularly waking up, mirror, and kitchen scenes. These are the deeply introspective montages where the POV character explains to the reader who they are, how the reader should think of them, and I personally don't like them because it often errs into the narrator speaking directly to the reader, which I'm not a fan of. I love being a silent observer, and any disruption to that illusion pulls me out of the story. Again, a lot of dystopian books are examples of these, like The Hunger Games or even Divergence, are good examples of that introspective or very cliche mirror or waking up scene done well, but can come across as spoon-feeding to the reader, like they can't handle action and information at the same time. It can also limit the escapism fantasy that reading gives because it's like showing the reader the mechanics and the thought process and the effort behind the story narrative flow. Number 2, sex scenes. Starting with a sex scene is always a bit of a hard sell for readers, even for the ones who love the spice. Just because sex is really intimate, especially in romance where it's not just about the physicality of it, but the emotional component is very much present. Starting with a sex scene is like the equivalent of you knowing that your parents had sex in order to have you, but you don't want to see it. But it's like a little less mentally scarring because an author can ease you into it first by getting you to fall in love with the characters individually so that when they're having the sex, you're celebrating the physical expression of the emotional feelings behind it all. I think it's even more startling when it's a violent sex scene or a sexual assault scene. Definitely give content warnings about that shit up front. Back when I was a baby editor, I had to comment on not having a sexual assault flashback right as the first chapter because that is instantly affronting to the reader. And it almost scars them in a way that they don't even want to see any sex going forward after that. If you've ever read Big Rock by Lauren Blakely, that book combines both the introspective and sex scene openings by having a hero wax on poetic about the awesomeness of his dick, all tied up in being a male-only POV book. It does a lot that is polarizing, and the reviews go from this to this. But Lauren Blakely has a huge fan base who loves her for her low angst and humorous but heartwarming and tropey voice. This book delivers on her author promise while twisting her readers' expectations in a comfortable but still yet novel experience. So you see her fans who gave her a chance because they've come to trust her and her author brand actually enjoyed that book because it met all their expectations of a Lauren Blakely book, but it also introduced them to a new experience, such as a hero only book or hero POV only book. Again, if you've read my blog post, Ways to Identify If and Why Your Story Doesn't Hook, this is a good example of Blakely knowing her voice and what her readers want, so she's comfortable enough to play with those expectations and try something new while knowing her day one fans will rock with her. If you haven't read Big Rock, I highly recommend it, especially in audio, because Sebastian York does a phenomenal job. And it's fun, it's sweet, and it's an all around good time. Number 3, action scenes or violence. Again, going back to the whole start with the action thing, action scenes or unexplained violence with no context is a harder sell for a reader because they don't know why any of this is happening and why they should care. If you're missing that raison d'etre explanation of why the characters thought this level of violence was necessary, then the reader has no emotional involvement to care one way or the other whether the POV character survives the situation. It's almost a better idea to start before the violence or the action. That way the reader can see the family bonds and the stakes of whatever results from that fight and why they should care about all of that. Jessica Gaziella, I hope I'm saying that right, has a mafia romance called The Woman in the Trunk, and she actually starts with a what I call the what the actual fuck action scene in a short prologue. I think it's like a page and a half, where the guy, the hero, is thinking about how his kidnap in progress would give him 100-year jail sentence if he was caught. But then it quickly backtracks to how he got into the situation in the first place. It then goes to the more normal mafia interrogation basement scene, which mafia readers like, and introduces mafia tropes they recognize. If you know, you know. Again, this is another author who has a very dedicated readership who trusts her. So even when when it takes the reader some time to warm up to the story, and this particular book is slower to start than some of her other ones, because it also explores like darker criminal side of things, so it's also giving novel stuff. They trust by the end of the book that the prologue and the opening will all make sense and the payoff will be so worth it. Number 4, dialogue heavy scenes. Similarly, starting with a very dialogue heavy scene when the reader hasn't had a chance to get to know the characters' voices can be very confusing. They don't know the character and their personality, so basically you're expecting them to take their words at face value, and it's a little bit like reading a text message or an email from somebody you don't know and wondering if they're being rude or sarcastic. You just don't know them well enough to tell. This is also where a lot of authors kind of fall into, as you know, Bob dialogue, which talks down to the reader. And then again, it feels like you're showing the mechanics and the heavy lifting behind the writing. It's clunky, and it's a bit unpleasant to get through. Now, opening with a dialogue is fine if you then give that narrative backstory of what's going on to give the reader context on what's happening. But if it's like a page and a half of just dialogue with very little action or dialogue tags, then chances are your readers are not going to continue reading because they're fucking confused. I feel like a lot of rom-coms often start with dialogue-heavy scenes that really do that contextual narrative heavy lifting to explain to the reader what's going on and why this is normal. Like chapter 1, instant dialogue and banter, probably between the protagonist and their best friend. Normally, this is some kind of statement. There's this statement that's kind of like, it's very normal for them to interact this way. Insert signal to the reader here. But again, the relatability and the accessibility of such a heavy dialogue opening really also depends on how normal or real world the rom-com premise is or feels. In rom-coms that take the reader a little out of their comfort zone, like it's not your now normalized cooking competition show, small town rom-com, there's often a prologue or an introsection that helps give some context to what is going on, and it gives enough for the reader to go on while they get through that opening dialogue moment. Off the top of my head, I'm thinking of the opening Be Featured ad at the beginning of Devon and Chris Plan a Wedding by Chinsia C. Higgins, and the full-on prologue at the beginning of Therese Bahari's And They Lived Happily Ever After. They give just enough for the reader to not be like 100% confused before they get to that explanatory narrative in between the witty friendship, banter, and dynamics, that even if the reader didn't read the back cover copy, they'd still have a sense of what is going on. And lastly, number 5, we have non-protagonist or love interest scenes right at the opening. Starting with an inconsequential or inconsistent POV is almost like the greatest bait and switch somebody can do to a reader. There's like this assumption that the POV character you start off a book with is the protagonist, the character whose story you're really telling, and everybody else is kind of along for the journey and will contribute to the protagonist's journey in a significant way, whether this is being their support system, like their family members or friends, or their love interest if you're writing a romance, or their partners in crime if you're writing a mystery. Having an entire chapter or a scene at the beginning of a book from a POV character who otherwise dies or disappears or actually plays like a very minimal role in the protagonist's life almost feels like a bait and switch, because you got the reader invested in that person's story only to flip the script and tell a different story altogether. And this ties back to genre expectations and how they influence how you structure your opening to your book. In romance, readers are often used to either dual or single POV from the protagonist or the protagonist and their love interest POVs only. Once in a while, and it's still a bit of a harder sell, you'll see the antagonist POV in crossover subgenres like romantic suspense or romantic thrillers. My mental list of books that start in the antagonist POV doesn't really exist, just because I'm personally not a fan, though many books do have the antagonist POV later on in the story. However, Jamie Gold has an insanely excellent post about the reasons for and the thought process behind starting with the antagonist POV. I think it's called the Should Our Protagonist Be in the First Scene? I think. So if you've been thinking about doing it, definitely check that one out. I hope you found this video helpful in understanding why certain scenes don't make for great openers if you don't do the necessary work to make sure you're not creating confusion and frustration for your readers. You don't know how many books I have to reject because of an inability to connect with the characters, not just from a craft perspective, but understanding the author's writing choices. I always try to give the benefit of the doubt, but when that confusion just increases with each page I read, it gets really hard to justify why I should continue reading when there's so many querying authors who make better writing choices. And as sad as it is to say, it all comes down to trusting that the author will make the choices that will benefit the reader or the story at each stage of revisions. And if you want the reader to connect with your characters and your story, and readers to know and trust you as an author, then you need to build that relationship with them. Readers who know and trust you as an author are way more forgiving and willing to see where you take them than new to you readers. It's the same principle that results in new to you readers being way more willing to pick up the first in a series at a lower price point because they don't know you or trust that you'll provide an experience that makes the higher price point worth their monetary time and emotional investment. Again, the 5 types of scenes I mentioned in this video can be done, but they have to be done well or with a firm understanding of your audience and what will anchor them to the story while you play with an unconventional or cliche opening scene or storyline. It's just food for thought and things to look out for as you're revising your manuscript. Let me know in the comments what kind of opening scenes you struggle with as a reader and what type of opening you've been contemplating writing as an author. I have a super exciting Path to Print guest episode coming out next week with the amazing Jidasola James, and we talk about the kind of freedoms that come with building your audience and earning your publisher and your readers' trust, and how the types of stories and openings you can explore changes as that relationship develops. So make sure you're either subscribed to my YouTube channel or my podcast on your streamer of choice. I'll make sure to put all the links in the description. I'll see y'all next time. See ya. Bye.